Hi, welcome back. This is part 1, Act 2 of Pygmalion Summary. At the end of Act 1, we see Eliza Doolittle, our flower girl, and she is at her sparsely decorated apartment, and she is dreaming of being a lady. At the beginning of Act 2, we get a contrast between Eliza's apartment and Henry's room in his house. Now we just see one room, and this happens to be his study, his laboratory where he studies the science of language. In Henry's one room, we see that he has more furniture in this room than Eliza has in her little apartment. He has a couple of couches, he has a big comfy chair, little end tables next to all these pieces of furniture. He has a telephone and a telephone directory. He has a nice roaring gas fire, and he doesn't have to put money into it to get his heat on. He's quite wealthy. He has lamps. He has an old-timey phonograph, which would be a record player, used to record the voices that he's heard. He has 2 huge filing cabinets filled with all the paperwork that he's compiled over all the years. On his walls, there are real pictures, not like Eliza's. In Eliza's apartment, she had just little torn out magazine photos and things like that of what a lady should look like. Henry has actual pictures. Henry also has in this room a huge grand piano, and on top of the piano there is this bowl, and in the bowl are chocolates. Now, Eliza has probably never had chocolates before because chocolates were at one time something that only the wealthy had. These chocolates will later be used to entice Eliza to perform very well on her lessons. Okay, so after we've gotten the description of his room, we see that Henry and Colonel Pickering are talking about the differences of language and the vowel sounds. And Colonel Pickering's getting quite tired, as you or I might get tired as well. About that time, Henry's housemaid, Mrs. Pierce, walks in and says that there is a young lady waiting to see him. And she says that she has a common, low voice. And Henry gets excited, thinking he has a new prospect for an experiment. About that time, in walks Eliza. And she walks in what she thinks is a stately fashion, very ladylike and queenly. And she's got this huge hat on with 3 big orange, blue, and red feathers. And she thinks she looks very regal and pretty, but in fact she actually looks kind of clownish. Henry says, "Oh, I don't want her. I've had enough of the Listen Grove lingo. Be gone with you." And she says, "Don't you be so saucy. You ain't heard what I come to ask you about." And Mrs. Pierce says, "What would a gentleman want with the likes of you?" And it goes back and forth, and Henry tries to shoo her away, and she comes back and says, "I want to be a lady. I want to sell flowers in a flower shop instead of at the end of Tottenham Court Road." Well, she says that she has money to pay for these lessons to become a lady. And of course the money that she has, it comes from the money that Henry threw down at her last night. Well, when Henry figures it up, he figures up this enormous amount, and he says that it's 60 pounds for her lessons. And Eliza is shocked, and she says, "But I ain't got 60 pounds. And she starts sniveling and everything. And Mrs. Pierce says, "Don't cry. And no one's going to touch your money." Henry threatens, he says, someone will hit her with a stick if she doesn't stop sniveling, and that he will be worse than 2 fathers to her. He goes on and he says, "Oh, this is going to be so great." Colonel Pickering says that he is interested, and he comes up with the idea And he says, Higgins, what about the ambassador's party? I will wager that if you can transform her into a duchess within 3 months, that Pickering will pay for all of the lessons. That means all of the food, all of the clothing, the jewelry, everything. And Henry gets excited, and he says, it's almost irresistible. She's so deliciously low, so horribly dirty. And Eliza says, I ain't dirty. I wash my face and hands afore I come. Well, they go on with the argument, and he says, yes, in 6 months, in three, if she has a good ear, we can transform this draggle-tailed guttersnipe. Mrs. Pierce, take her away and take off all her clothes and burn them. Well, Eliza gets scared about that idea of taking her clothes. I mean, after all, she has just walked into a strange man's house, and where she comes from, that means something quite different than from what Henry's asking. Henry sees her as just like a lab rat, something to experiment with. And Mrs. Pierce says, but I don't have any place for her. And Henry's like, well, just throw her in the dustbin. And all throughout this, Eliza makes horrible noises like, ah, and is highly offended. Mrs. Pierce warns Henry that it is not like picking a pebble up off the beach. It is not that easy. That he must think about the consequences. And she says, well, what about her parents? And we find out, Eliza says, but I ain't got no parents. My parents have all kicked me out, and she has 6 stepmothers, and her father, that we will later learn, is an alcoholic. And Eliza has pretty much taken care of herself all this time. Henry says, well, she can get married when she's done. And Eliza's like, who would marry me? And because she doesn't think that she's worth anything. Well, Henry says he will give her clothes, he will give her jewelry and things like that. And all this time, Eliza, when she hears this, she says, but I don't want any clothes, I don't want any jewelry. I'm a good girl, I am. So Higgins says, well, we'll take her, and what does she want with money anyway? Because Mrs. Pierce has said that she needs to be paid something. She needs to receive something so that when she does leave Higgins' home, eventually in 6 months, she'll be able to take care of herself. Henry says that all she will do with the money is, of course, buy alcohol, because that's a stereotype that he has, that poor people must always throw away their money on alcohol. Okay? So Eliza thinks that when he mentions the jewelry and all of these clothes, that he's asking for one thing. That he's asking for what guys down in her district of the poor section would want in return for these things. So we're left at the end of part 1 of Act 2 summary with Eliza heading off with Miss Pierce. She's about to have her clothes taken away to get new ones, and Mrs. Pierce is about to scrub her down. But as a caution, Henry really does have to think about what is to become of Eliza. What is to become of her? Because when a person changes, they can't go back to where they were. That's the end of part 1, Act 2 summary.